Welcome. This session picks up from the Create and Discover Data Sources video and looks at how to view entities, attributes, and relationships. We will review our understanding of entities and attributes and demonstrate the two different methods to access and view entities, attributes, and relationships in Legoz. Rather than being tables themselves, entities in Legoz are the instructions for locating data that would typically reside in tables. This is because the data sources Legoz connects to are not always relational databases with tables, columns, and rows. The system can process both schema-based and schema-less data. Thus, the data could originate from sources such as data feeds, Excel spreadsheets, CSV files, or even documents. By the same token, attributes are not columns. They are the instructions about the way the data is organized within the entity, in a similar way to columns within a table. There are several steps that must be completed when creating and discovering a new data source. We have already discussed adding the data source properties, updating data source parameter values, testing the data source connection, discovering the data source, and granting access to the data source. In this video, we will discuss the last step, which is viewing the data source entities, attributes, and relationships. To begin, log into Legoz using valid user credentials that grant access to the relevant organization. Note that to manage data sources, your user profile must include permissions to access the data sources menu item. On logging in, expand the Legoz menu option by clicking on the down arrow next to it. There are two methods of viewing entities. The first method is to select the Data Sources menu option to open the Data Sources screen. At the top of the grid, you will see buttons to create and delete a data source, as well as buttons to view a data source's entities, discover a data source, validate a data source, and test its connection. Note that the Create button is enabled by default, allowing you to initiate the creation process, while the remaining buttons are disabled until you select a data source from the grid. First, filter for and select the relevant data source. In this example, we will use the Chinook MS SQL data source. The View Entities button will be active. Select it. You will be redirected to the Entities screen. Notice that the Entities menu option is now active. As you selected a data source first and were then redirected to the Entities screen, the Entities list that displays is automatically filtered to only display entities for that data source. Note the filter applied to the data source code column. The Go to Data Sources and Advanced Search buttons are enabled, and the Delete button is disabled. The Delete button will only become enabled if an entity is selected in the grid. Once you have selected the entity to delete, a pop-up message asks you to confirm that you want to proceed. Click Confirm to proceed or Cancel to cancel the request. You apply additional filters using the entity code and description columns in the grid. Once a filter is inserted, the Clear All Filters button becomes available, and the additional filters will be cleared. The filter on the data source code column will remain in place. This is a view-only grid, so none of the data in the fields can be edited. Two inline grid functions are available. The attribute function allows users to view and delete attributes that exist in the selected entity. The relationship function allows users to view the relationship between any attributes in the selected entity, or with attributes from other entities. Now that you know how to navigate the screen, let's investigate an entity. The entities for the Chinook data source are listed. Notice how the entity code is generated as data source _ system table name. In this example of the Chinook database diagram, the entity codes for this data source are the same as the table names. Select the Chinook DBO album entity and click on the Attributes Inline Function button. In this example, the attributes represent the columns within the album table, and the attribute code is derived from the column name in the data source. If you were to view the Chinook table in SQL, you'd see that the columns within the album table are the same. Being derived from the data source, the attribute codes might not be very intuitive to users. The attribute-friendly name field allows you to rename the attribute to something more user-friendly once the attribute is used on a data object. The system converts the data types from the data source to the most appropriate corresponding data type within Fraxes. You can see how the data types for this table have been specified in the Fraxes data type code field. Where a property is a tick box, its box will be ticked if the value is true. For example, if the attribute is a primary key, the primary key box will be ticked. It is possible to view the attribute's relationships by selecting the View Relationships button. But in this instance, we will return to the Entity tab without making any changes to the attributes. Click on the Relationships Inline Function button to open the Relationships modal, where you can view discovered relationships between the attributes in this entity and other entities. You will notice a relationship between the album and track entities on the artist and album ID attributes. You are also able to select the View Attributes button to go directly to the Attributes modal. Close the Relationships modal to return to the Entities screen. An advanced search function is also provided on this screen. Note that any filter applied to the Entities grid is not applied to the Advanced Search modal. The Advanced Search modal displays in grid format. This grid enables the user to apply a filter or any combination of filters, including filtering on tags, to view specific entities and attributes within their data sources. Filters are applied by simply entering a value into the red filter field supplied under each column heading. Selecting the Clear All Filters button will clear filters and reset the grid. Close the modal. The Go to Data Sources button is used to return to the data source screen, should you wish to select a different data source, to view its entities, etc. The second method of accessing and viewing entities is to select the Entities menu option without going through the data source screen first. The Entities grid will present you with an unfiltered list of every discovered entity from all data sources to which your role has access. You can then apply any necessary filters as described previously. If you have watched all the videos in the Data Source Management playlist, you now have a clear understanding of data sources, how to create and discover them, and then view and interrogate their entities, attributes, and relationships. Thank you for watching. Catch you in the next one.